we have to share a podium. So this is where we throw the bits of paper, there's no room. Okay, as many of you know, on Friday we're launching our report, The Way He Tells It, at the first Australian Conference on Family Violence After a Disaster. This specific focus on two key concerns, family violence and disaster, is bringing people from around the country and overseas. Now, we're about to close registrations with 190 people attending so far, so we're going to be banging on to a lot of them. The issue is clearly relevant for many people at all levels of disaster planning, response and recovery, and for us, vindicates our perseverance in bringing it to attention. We know that Australians have a 1 in 6 chance of experiencing a disaster, and we know that family violence increases after a disaster. It is our responsibility to ensure that the most vulnerable members of our communities are considered and protected during these times, as Elaine has also been saying. Today we'll give you snapshots of people's real experiences through their own words to illustrate some key areas highlighted in our report. All the names, of course, have been changed.
On Black Saturday, Fran left her Marysville home as planned, taking her children, pets. Okay. On Black Saturday, Fran left her Marysville home as planned, taking her children, pets, and a neighbour's child to safety. She cried as she kissed her husband goodbye. He, a firefighter, had responsibilities and a job to do. She says that was the last time she saw her husband. No, he didn't die. He fought the fires and survived, but that survival and the horrors he witnessed and the emotions he experienced brought him home a changed man. After a terrifying day, fearing the worst, Fran was reunited with her husband. Rick, she told us, was deeply shaken by this experience, very shut down. He managed to give me a hug, but there was nothing behind it. That's pretty much the status quo since then.
The status quo is that now they're divorced and their family's broken. The months after Black Saturday were a nightmare for Fran as she tried to reconnect with her husband, who became more withdrawn, refused to speak, and eventually became abusive, threatening, and attempting suicide. We asked what help was available for him and others whose role it was to fight the fires, and were told that there were counselling opportunities, if needed. In the predominantly male-dominated culture of the CFA and DSE, to ask for help is perceived as being less of a man. Needless to say, not many took up the opportunity, especially in the early months. One worker described men's reactions to counselling.
I saw an advertisement a month ago. It was something about, are you angry all the time? Come and join a men's self-help group. They would have all looked at it and just gone, oh, fuck off, I'm not interested in that.
Counselling may have stemmed the flow of trauma, anger, grief and frustration for some men, but generally it did not get a good uptake. Many workers lamented the difficulties in engaging men to discuss and debrief. The upshot of this refusal or inability to access help in some cases resulted in behaviour that brought further damage to women and families.
Michelle told us, well, my husband said that the fire just didn't affect him. I don't think that's true because we're getting divorced. I don't see how any human being could have that experience and be unaffected and emotionally unaffected by it. He just said, I was fine, I just got on with it. Any human being is going to be affected by that, and I think that he's completely shut down.
Women and workers told us of individuals and communities struggling to cope with the aftermath of the traumatic events of the day and the ongoing burdens that accompanied recovery and reconstruction. They told of widespread use of alcohol and drugs, previous traumas exacerbated by Black Saturday, mental health issues, and community and personal violence.
Jenny told us, my house was turned into a pub. It was a mess. There were things everywhere. There were 5 guys all pissed as newts. There was a lot of free booze. And Di told us, my friend lived in this street with a lot of men who were really, really traumatised. Women were traumatised, but the men really started to drink. My friend was having people rock up at the door at all times of the day. They were drinking in the street. They were getting together as blokes.
The increase in alcohol and drug use and the impact of the fires exacerbated the behaviours of some men who had a previous history of violence, increasing it to dangerous levels. We spoke with Sandra, who contacted the police, fearing for her life when her husband viciously attacked her after drinking excessively.
I called 000 and it took them 2 hours to get there. I mean, I was scared. I wouldn't have called them otherwise. I went to the police and then he didn't even know that they'd come because he was in bed. It was blown over by then. And they told me they were going to ring in the next few days or something to see how I was. I never heard back from them at all. But then he called me and he said to me, "Oh, the police just called me." And they asked did I want counselling for my alcohol problem. Because he had no idea that they'd come. And I said, "Okay, what did you say?" And he said, I said, "How'd you get my number? And I don't have an alcohol problem." I mean, they knew he'd gone to bed. I was scared stiff.
Luckily, he didn't link the call to his wife. Some women, now 3 years on, still fear for their lives and the repercussions from partners or indeed the community if they speak out about what they're going through and what it's been like living with an abusive partner since the fires. Some women withdrew key sections of their interview in order to protect him and often themselves. These were usually the more graphic and damning accounts of their partner's abusive behaviour. Workers too withdrew sections of their interviews that identified major systems lapses that may have left women even more vulnerable. Ironically, we were told by family violence workers that women previously on their books had asked to be taken off. They knew instinctively that there would be fallout from the aftermath of the bushfires and that there would be women needing help with family violence.
That help did not always come. Sandra contacted DV Services looking to find a sympathetic ear. She told of her husband's increasing violence and excessive drinking after the fires and her fears for her safety. It was a relief to speak so openly and to be heard. However, when the DV worker heard she had a bushfire case manager, she was handballed over to her. Although a kind person, the case manager was inexperienced and not at all equipped to deal with family violence issues. And Sandra's issues were complex. A real fear of retribution, tied in financially with her husband's business and no view of escape. After being passed to other case managers, equally kind, equally ill-equipped, Sandra gave up. Her final words to us were, "I'll get out of here in a box."
There is no doubt that women with children should be listed as vulnerable persons during a disaster, and even less doubt that women and children known to be experiencing family violence noted as priorities. What we learnt confirms that the myth of women and children first in a disaster is indeed just that, a myth.
A worker said to us, "Society expects men to protect their families, and women, in many cases, expect to be protected. In a disaster, the stakes are raised, as man as protector is no longer just a symbolic role. On Black Saturday, protecting families was life-threatening and largely dependent on factors beyond the power of individuals. Naturally, not all men were able to do this."
Some women whose partners were part of the immediate fire response never expected to be on their own that day, never expected their partner, an expert and trained in fire response, would not be there to protect them. These women had to make their own escapes, often with children, or fight the fires without the help of the men they relied upon. One woman said, "He was my fire plan." The women told of their own and their partners' behaviours on Black Saturday. Some were admirable and some were not. The myth that women will be cared for by men is most exposed in one account, where a man saved himself first, then his 2 small children, leaving his wife and her older children unprotected in a life-threatening situation. They escaped in the back of an open ute, driving through fire on both sides of the road and burning embers falling from above.
Sally told us, "I'm looking at this man and going, 'You shoved us in the back of the ute?' He was inside. He put himself before the kids, and that's what got to me. I said to him recently when things blew up, 'Mate, you could have stuck all those 4 kids in the front and you should have got in the back with me.' He used to often say that he'd be good in an emergency. It just went to this look on his face that said, 'You don't count as much as me.'"
In the cultural storytelling, men are cast as protector and hero, and women as damsels in distress, waiting to be rescued. Yet, when women's voices are heard and documented, it seems that the knight in shining armour during a disaster is equally likely to be a woman as a man. For many children being driven out of the fires on Black Saturday, their protector was a woman. Their mum saved their lives.
Suzanne described her escape, leading another car with a driver from overseas. I went to the CFA. It was chaos, just chaos. We got to the St Andrews turn-off. It was like an atomic bomb had gone off there. The sky was coming down on us, and as far as you could see was orange and red and getting darker and lower and lower. I just wanted to try and get a tarred road that had wide access so we could travel quickly on. So we took Mount Slide Road. I sort of knew what was happening, but in your mind you tell yourself not to think about that. We just sped to the Melbourne Highway. I had my little ones with me, and a friend from overseas was in the car behind with the older kids. I had to slow down on a bend so my girlfriend, who'd never driven on the left-hand side before, didn't lose it on this sweeping corner. I was trying to get to Yarra Glen to get to Eltham, but we couldn't. I couldn't even get onto the road. There were just so many cars that were fleeing. This woman just put her head out the window and said, "Get out of here." We looked over and there was a fire there. All of a sudden, I had 4 lives that I was responsible for and my own. I shook uncontrollably. I drove with the masses, 140 kilometres an hour.
Fortunately, she and her children and friends survived. The myth of women being protected by men in a disaster is further exposed in an account from Jan Cooper, a family violence crisis worker working on the eve of Black Saturday. She said this memory continues to haunt her.
I received a call from a woman at around 3 in the morning. She told me the history of abuse from her partner. It is honestly abuse that's much too gruesome and personal to repeat here, but suffice to say things were really bad, had been bad for a long time, and were getting worse. Then she told me that people in her town were enacting their bushfire plans because it was a bushfire region. She said that her plan was always to leave early, but tonight, after abusing her, her partner took the keys to the car and said, "I hope there is a bushfire tomorrow and I hope you die in it." And then he took the car and left. She had no other plans for getting away. I suggested she seek help from neighbours. She said they were 2 kilometres away. It's the middle of the night and she doesn't want to tell them what's going on. I offered to help her get out and assist her to stay in some emergency accom. She didn't want this. She hated the idea of the stigma around staying in a women's refuge. We explored if her mother could come and pick her up from Melbourne. This woman wanted none of these things. She said she would actually take her chances with the bushfire, and that's actually how the call ended.
This frightening account leads us to revisit why women don't report family violence. Double or triple that for rural areas. Multiply by 100 after a disaster. The abusive partner may have been a hero. Everyone is traumatised, and agencies and women can't help but feel compassion for what he has been through. What she has been through and is going through seems to fall through the cracks. Women told us of friends and family ignoring their pleas for help and even suggesting the women were at fault for not caring enough.
Shelley said, "When I spoke to friends about it, this is severe physical assault against her, they would turn a blind eye to it and say, 'You'll sort it out.'"
A person's first port of call when threatened is often the police. After the bushfires, the police did not or were not able to respond to calls for help from women.
Gay had suffered abuse by her partner after the fires. We asked her if they were helpful. No, they weren't helpful at all, actually. No, they were very chauvinistic about it all. They just weren't helpful. It was like, we don't really want to know. We've known him all his life. He's a good bloke.
Shelley had left an abusive relationship and rebuilt a life and a career in her hometown. The fires destroyed her workplace and she lost lifelong friends. Under the guise of helping her, her ex returned and so did his behaviour.
Then, a week and a half after the fires, he was verbally abusing me at my home, pushing and shoving me and not letting me walk out my back door, and hit me and choked me and things like that. I rang the police. They came, he admitted it, they arrested him, and the police said to me, "He'll be going to court again because he just breached the intervention order. We'll speak to you tomorrow," which never happened, and he ended up going to court and the police didn't even show up there at all. They never told me why. But speaking to my police officer friend, she said they were very busy. They were all dealing with the fires. Apparently I'm not that important.
The bushfires created opportunities for opportunistic men to re-enter and exploit the lives of now vulnerable women. A number were not living in the fire-affected areas at the time, but returned to try to cash in on grants, insurance payouts and opportunities. This remains a serious concern. On the home front, interview data suggested that the choices in re-establishing lives after Black Saturday were gendered. While both men and women had some choice in returning to work, there was no choice for women when it came to caring for their children. Men seemed to be free to choose if they would extend help with the care of their own children. They chose how much of a role to play in the home and in their children's lives. That freedom to choose was not granted to women.
Holly said, as the wife in the situation or the mother, you don't have the luxury of saying, oh, fuck it, I'm sick of this, someone else do it, because the buck stops with you. And Emma said, women get together and cry and hold each other, then go, righto girl, back in the game. There you go, you had your little sulk, we love you, we understand, we've all been through it, go make dinner.
Women's return to work, especially considering the impact of the fires on the children, relied on stable and loving childcare arrangements, and this was the case regardless of the woman's occupation. In two couples, the women held better paid and more senior jobs than their partners, and both still had to assume primary care of the children in the emotional and physical absence of their father. Both women had no choice but to give up their very senior positions in the absence of supporting fathers and in the absence of supportive workplaces.
Annie held a senior health service position before the fires. She said, I couldn't return to work because I had no childcare and the schools hadn't reopened. So I said to him, if you work 4 days, let me go to work 1 day, and that way I can keep some sort of income coming in and I can keep paying the mortgage. And anyway, he never did that, so I was unable to get back to work.
Gendered responses to disaster have huge implications on communities, on our expectation of who is vulnerable and who is able to respond, what restrictions and assumptions are placed on men and women, and who gets to say in how we plan for disaster and recovery. Women's voices are often not heard, and that may sound like a cliche, but it remains true in the context of disasters, where women are still the ones who keep silent to prevent further harm to others, where they are denied a say because they have no way of attending a meeting to have that say, because they have full responsibility for children and have limited or no access to transport, where their daily existence becomes one of dependencies as work opportunities disappear and they are once again relegated to home duties, and where they may be kept in check by an abusive partner and a culture that would prefer to look away. During last year's Queensland floods, we were approached by Queensland Police having heard of our yet-to-be-published research. They wanted us to tell them what we could about family violence after disaster. They were gearing up for what we now know is inevitable, and we were very glad to be of help. The observations of the 76 people we consulted led to a number of recommendations for policy and practice emerging from this research. The recommendations are broken into 3 and directed towards disaster prevention agencies, disaster response and disaster recovery services. In a broad sense, family violence must be a central consideration in policies that frame disaster planning and recovery with ongoing involvement from family violence specialists. Key recommendations from our report are: establish disaster guidelines at national, state and local levels that prioritise family violence and require accurate recording of statistics. Establish and promote a national preferred provider register of trauma practitioners who have a sound understanding of family violence.
Train human service workers in post-disaster areas to identify family violence and refer appropriately, for example, craft training. Include the likelihood of increased family violence in disaster and mental health first aid courses.
Provide compulsory debriefing to emergency services personnel in the immediate post-disaster period. Employ local men and women in paid reconstruction efforts and offer a supported return to work.
Victoria Police have a strong history of turning around attitudes to domestic violence, and there's an opportunity for them to take it up after disaster. Challenge expectations that men will behave in a defined masculine way by encouraging the expression of safe emotion. Research effective ways to engage men in support strategies.
include women in all areas of disaster response and planning, and critically, address, not excuse men's violence and affirm women's and children's right to live free from violence after a disaster. We hope our work in this area assists you in your planning for the future in our region. Thank you.
Do you want to come grab a bit, get a bit closer to the folks?
Sure.
See whether we can get a bit of a discussion and, once again, comments as well, like things that you've seen happening that either perhaps support some of the things that Des and Claire have been talking about, or that you think kind of are working in these kind of spaces. That any kind of comments or questions, I'll just leave you to field.
Fielding.
Yeah, just to pick up on that thread about women having their voice through counselling, case management, so their response, putting forward their issues, and then that some of them elected to actually have it withdrawn from records. And you mentioned, the system is at play there. Is there anything from your learnings that you believe could change the system to allow better representation and that data being forthcoming?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the managers of this service within the region, a domestic violence service, a high-level manager, was saying that there hadn't been any increased demand on their service, and she was thinking that perhaps the women involved in our survey were aggrieved by the system. And I think we need to take an approach that Women's Health have tried to progress for a long time, called equity, where a service is offering services to people with disabilities or Aboriginal people or whoever. Don't just say, we're open, our doors are here, come and see us, but they actively engage and try and work out what their system is doing that's stopping people approaching them. And what's characterised our research is the silencing of women in regard to this, even by health professionals. So I think that services need to turn it around and go and bring those women in.
We must have covered it.
So how did you then find the women? If you're saying that the services were hadn't had access, or they weren't accessing, how did you find them?
We advertised. We put ads everywhere. We put ads in all their local papers, the free papers, in some metro papers and the local papers around that Mitchell and Murrindindi areas. So it was like that. We had posters up in agencies. So there was no referrals from any agencies. It was all women wanting to speak to us.
We actually applied for ethics approval, and that was given on the basis that we didn't work through agencies, but rather women would see the advertisement and apply directly.
What's happening on Friday? Oh, it's the hidden disaster, the family violence after disaster conference, which in Melbourne. Yeah, on your cards, on the postcards there, they've got the website. It's got all the information on it. If anybody wants to go to that, you can't register online. Online registrations are closed, but you can go directly to Leanne, the conference organiser. Her details are on the brochure, and go through her, and we'll all snuggle up and just put somebody else in.
Might have to hang you from the roof.
But look, we've had response from everywhere. So, Robin, I was thinking about you. We're going to bang on to a very big crowd of people who obviously are really interested in what's going on.
Can I just say thank you very much. This is an area that's so underexplored. You have no idea. So internationally, I've been following this literature for a long time. We have a few case studies here, or organizational studies there, or a survey here, a focus group there. We have never had, to my knowledge, this kind of rich ethnographic data, and I just really want to applaud you for doing that. It's such a value, just this resource is just wonderful. And are we going to be able to access it online so I can post it elsewhere? Because it's a perfect training piece that will be used in all the English-speaking countries that I know of where we're doing this kind of work. It's hugely important what you two have done, so thank you.
Oh, thank you. It will be on the website on Friday after the conference.
And we think it's really important to have those voices of women, the actual words, because we can be very desensitized to statistics, and that they're sort of shocking at first, then you get used to it. But the words, the actual words of the people involved, women and workers, I think people sit up and notice because they're real people. You know, what did someone say? Statistics are people with the tears wiped off.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
right.
Well, we get to see the tears.
You get to feel it.
Yeah.
So can you tell us more about your methodology and your research? How did you go about hearing these silences and then drawing on them?
Yeah. In the end, we had a sample of 47 workers and 29 women. And the way we did it was to, straight after the fires, we thought, what can we do to help? And this is our area, and we know that women's voices are not generally included in the accounts of momentous occasions. So we thought that we would record women's voices. And 9 months after the fire, we did our round of interviews with workers to find out when was a good time to go into the communities, because we knew that they were very sensitised and traumatised. And the workers consistently said, wait till after the first anniversary. So we did that. We advertised, as Claire said. When the women contacted us, they said where and when they wanted to be interviewed, and we went. We transcribed the women's interviews. I took notes for the workers' interviews. Some we transcribed. And then we analysed it using grounded theory and used in vivo software to help.
Do you have any form of questionnaire or structure?
Yeah, they were semi-structured in-depth interviews. So we do have, there's about probably 7 questions. It's in the report, so on Friday you can see that.
And that'll be on the website too. So look, really it's listening. So when you say we have a survey, we have questions that guide us, but sometimes women want to tell us something that's out of that, and we just listen.
And grounded theory allows the truth to emerge that you weren't necessarily questioning, but you trip over, you discover.
And look, sometimes we do have to question and probe a little bit more, because what we've learnt, and with other research too, but very much with this, is women will play down what's happened to them. So when you hear something like she said, oh, he became much more angry. Well, you know, I get angry at home too sometimes, but then you say, well, what form did that take? And then you hear about dreadful shouting, abuse and physical violence. But a woman would just say he got more angry and he was a little bit threatening. They're very reluctant to put out what's happened to them, but that's what we need to know, because otherwise it's very played down. The use of euphemisms is pretty huge too.
It's huge. There was one interview in particular, I remember, a woman who was very quietly spoken, and she was talking about her husband's impatience. And Claire said, what kind of things? You know, can you tell us what he was doing? And she said, oh, he would say, you're not being proactive.
So we go, oh, that's pretty rough. That's very
rough. But at the end of the interview, we heard that he'd punched a hole in the door, or punched a dent in the door. And she said no one could talk to him, and she and her children were frightened of him. But she didn't just immediately come out with that.
So in your lessons learned from all of that, is there anything that the emergency services organisations can do better to help those women in the future? What is it that we can do?
I think it's about all of us being prepared to hear it. And another thing that I've been thinking of is that we're quite happy to hear about increased violence against, we're not happy, but we accept violence against women after the earthquakes in Haiti and the cyclones in Bangladesh. But I think it's different when we think about these men who are firefighters, CFA volunteers, they're good cops, you know, they're people who embody, you know, Australian resistance and heroism. And we don't want to think of them being violent in the home. So we do say things, emergency services, responders, in family, friends, we all say, oh, you know, he's really suffering at the moment, or it's not him, you know, he's acting out of character, give it some time. So I think what has to change is we need to take women seriously, because we know that they're not going to come straight out and tell you the extent of it. Take them seriously, name it for what it is. But then the whole other side of that is to try and work out some strategies that are going to work with men. You know, we know that the counselling doesn't necessarily work with all men. One key recommendation that came from some of the women was that as soon as the men come back, and the women, I'm sorry, I'm being so sexist, as soon as the men and the women come back from the emergency, to have them have some debriefing, that's mandatory. They don't get a say in it. They just have to go and do that. And the women thought it would be good to follow that up with some immediate counselling with their family as well. So there's a couple of recommendations in there.
And there's also checklists. There's the snapshots that we have there, but checklists for agencies to do, and including for the data collection, which we didn't speak of much here. We'll be speaking at the conference. How to put systems in place for accurate data collection. You know, if you think it's family violence, but you think quite often people will put down stress. You know, who knows then? Where's your evidence base, which is really important. So there's some very concrete things people can look at in their agencies to do.
There is actually one other really important one. A couple of the women said that their firefighter partners came home, but then immediately had to go back and fight the fires the next day. And in speaking briefly with someone from the DSE, they were saying that it is really hard. You know, they have a limited number of people. But if they could organise backfill from other states, you know, as soon as they know the disaster's happening, so that those same men and women who are in the front line can go home after that first shift.
Can I just, I guess, in the snapshots? Yes. So there's, you will have picked up from the front table, and that's got some of the recommendations that Claire and Deb mentioned at the end. So we will be moving into small groups in a minute to just talk about which of those are relevant. And there's some work there from Elaine that's also attached that's got suggestions. But I'm wondering whether there's any examples like from this group about things that you have already put in place. Do people hear about family violence in the work that you're doing? Are the relief centres, for instance, conscious that they need a safe place for women who might be at risk of family violence? Like, can we hear a little bit about what it is you already do to take this into account? Is that stuff happening at all?
Certainly DHS recently ran training on relief and recovery centres, and the question of an intervention order and both parties being on the same place was there. There's no easy resolution of it, but you know, that's even a legal issue that's created at that time too. But so it was mentioned, but there was no clear resolution
as to sort of what to do or how to kind of manage it.
It's awareness, right?
Yeah. Other people's experiences? Are you hearing about the violence that the researchers talked about?
There was an article in The Age, I think, a couple of months ago that was probably about this by that, which I cut out immediately and had it on the table last night to say that was probably the first time that I'd actually seen anything in the literature.
We also got a half-page spread in The Australian.
Woohoo!
You're welcome. But I guess it's new, it's just starting to unfold, right? That's what's happening. I think probably on the ground, it's still that thing of when you have violence happening in families in the community, there's a lot of risk for a woman to speak out, because it's not just what's happening within the family, but it's also the retribution from the community.
Yes.
And I guess that's probably one thing I'd like to raise in relation to, okay, we have disasters and we have the fallout effect, but the seeds are already there. And so that thing of how do we address that in relation to making our communities resilient by looking at how we provide that safeness, I suppose.
And perhaps that anticipation, because for many of our research participants, they had never been violence before. No, it was totally new and just devastating. For some, there had been incidents, but not a lot, and that blew up. And for others, it was violence revisited, quite often after they had split up, and much worse. So there's different areas there, very much.
What did you find with the percentages? Was the bulk of what you were finding post-disaster a new thing?
No, of the 29 women we spoke to, it was quite interesting because we were trying to work out how many of them were speaking about their own personal experience of domestic violence. And we figured 16 would fit that category because there were 14 speaking about their own relationship, one speaking about her daughters and the other her very close sister. The others, we were really struggling. Do they fit there or do they not? You know how it's really hard to know on that spectrum. And we were being very conservative, only putting people in there who had pretty severe family violence. And one of the women that we put in the not personally affected actually emailed later and said that she had been and she had called the police. So our numbers are conservative. Of the 16, 9 of them experienced family violence for the first time after the fires, and 7 of those people spoke of really settled and happy relationships before the fire.
And pretty well everybody, all the women that participated, we asked them why you're here, why you want to be part of this research, and they just said they wanted to help other women in other disaster circumstances so they wouldn't have to go through what they're going through.
So 3 years on, have you been back to see what's evolved over the last 2 years since you did the research?
Well, the research actually spread out because it was hard to recruit women. Part of the problem was it's a small population anyway, and then nobody knows for sure how many people have left the mountain, but colloquially people were saying half or 2/3 of the people had left the mountain or left the fire-affected regions. So smaller population again. What did you ask me?
Some have moved on. Some we've lost a couple totally. We can't reach.
Yeah.
Some have split up, and some are soldiering on.
Yeah, and the research actually took about a year and a bit to get those 29 women.
We had ethics approval for 30.
Yeah, and we did actually have 30,
30
but
but
one
one-
we thought probably didn't quite fit the criteria.
So tomorrow we're also going back to Yea. So we're running a session in Yea with Elaine, and the same sorts of things that Deb and Claire have been talking about, and we certainly have invited people who were part of the research and the general community as well. So there's a sense of kind of going back, although people won't be identified unless they kind of stand up and talk about it, but it will be taking the information back.
Really sensitive still down here.
Yes, they might not be smiling at us as you do.
No.
We don't know.
Okay, any final kind of questions? Because otherwise, Elaine, did you have another one?
Well, just many things come to mind. Just maybe I'll share another story because I think it's an example of how we could build from horrific events to perhaps move toward a more resilient society. And that comes from Nicaragua, where after Hurricane Mitch, there were many focus groups and psychosocial support systems in place. And one community thought that it was appropriate to work particularly with men around violence prevention. So they had this wonderful campaign that says, violence against women is one disaster that men can prevent. Right? Big billboards and bumper stickers. And I just put that forward as an example of forward thinking. And when we think about resilience, what does that really mean? If you can shift that dialogue just a little bit, and this was a men's post-hurricane movement, it's not going to happen in very many towns. It wouldn't happen in my hometown. But maybe if it happened in more of our hometowns, then the next time around, we have more consciousness and awareness of it. It's a story that cheers me up in the way.
Okay, thank you very much.